Sometimes in their haste to make a doctrinal point, preachers end up obscuring the beauty of the Bible passage that they're using and possibly missing the point altogether. And Isaiah 59 is a perfect illustration of this. Hey everyone, I'm Colin, the resident nerd and Bible scholar here at the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. Now, today, in just a few minutes, I want to look at the entirety of Isaiah 59. Don't worry, we're not going to go word by word through it. That would take longer than we have time even in a podcast episode. But I want to jump around this chapter a little bit to show you what I mean, that sometimes in our haste to make a doctrinal point, we end up obscuring the beauty of the Bible. It's kind of like in high school or middle school, if you had a biology class and you had to pin up insects on a board to study them. Take like a butterfly, for instance. A butterfly can be beautiful, but the second that you have to pin it up and try to make a point about it, it loses some of its beauty. The Bible is often like that. When we use it for our own ends, we are pinning it up on a board and missing the point there. There was only one reason Isaiah 59 would ever be read when I was growing up in church, and only the first two verses of the chapter were ever read. Let me go ahead and read them for you real fast here. Behold, Yahweh's hand is not shortened, that it can't save, nor his ear heavy, that it can't hear. But your iniquities have separated between you and your God, and your sins have hid his face from you, that he won't hear. Man, if I had a nickel for every time I heard that sin separates you from God. But for something that I heard so much in church, believe it or not, this is pretty much the only verse that explicitly says that. And if we start looking at the context, at the verses after it, it's not just some generic statement that all sin separates everyone from God for all of eternity. There are some very specific sins that are mentioned here, and they are violence against other people. They are ignoring need for justice in the land, is lying to other people, and a couple others that you can read in the following verses. So these particular verses are not making a statement for all people of all time. And notice too that it doesn't say your sins have separated you from God forever, or you are going to be separated from God forever in hell because of your sin. It's talking about a very present reality for Isaiah's generation. He is speaking to his generation of Israelites living under the Mosaic covenant. And if you continue to read through these verses, there is actually no hope of having that changed. See, we didn't realize that when we would preach it in church. We would always say, see, your sins separate you from God, but because of Jesus, you can be made right with God. But that's not the view in this passage. In fact, if you go down to verse 9, Isaiah switches person. He stops talking about you and how you've been separated from God and starts talking about how justice has been removed from us. He puts himself in this righteous remnant that is still trying to follow God and that can still be in right relationship with God. And he offers no hope of change for the people who have broken God's covenant in his land in his time. His point is that they have continued to go against God's covenant so many times that as far as God is concerned, they broke the covenant for the last time. Now that is not to say for all of Israel for all of time, but just for this particular set of people in Isaiah's day, that is the message that he had for them. So we have to be careful not to overgeneralize this passage to speak of eternity when it's actually speaking of a present reality. We also have to be careful not to make it talk about all people of all times when Isaiah was speaking to a very specific group of people within his land and his time. But all of that being said, those are the only two verses that we would ever focus on in church when I was growing up. But that totally misses the message of the passage. Now, I get why preachers want to focus on that one thing. The rest of the chapter can be a little hard to understand, particularly if you're reading in an older version like King James. But I just want to hop around through a few verses here and show you what you're missing out on if all you're trying to do is make a doctrinal point to get people inside the doors of your church and get saved. This passage is full of hyperlinks back to Genesis 1 through 11, particularly the creation narrative and the decreation narrative in the flood. Okay, like for example, in verse 5, Isaiah says they hatch cockatrices' eggs. And we're going, what in the world is a cockatrice? Great old King James word, right? Well, basically it's a word for a poisonous snake. Can that possibly take us back to anywhere in Genesis? I would think so. How about when the next verse says their webs, because it started talking about spiders, it says their webs shall not become garments, neither will they cover themselves with their works. The act of violence is in their hand. So you have someone now who is unable to make a garment for themselves, and they stand naked in their sin. Could that sound like anything from the start of Genesis? How about violence is in their hands, their feet run to evil, they make haste to shed innocent blood? Well, we were just in Genesis chapter 3. How about Genesis chapter 4 with Cain and Abel? If we bounce down to verse 9, Isaiah says, justice doesn't overtake us. We wait for light, but behold obscurity. Man, it kills me that the King James translators went for obscurity there. It's a legitimate word to translate, but it's just the word for darkness. And I wish they would have done that, because saying obscurity, you kind of miss the creation hyperlink here. But when you realize he's saying we wait for light, but look, darkness is all around us. That is reversing creation language. He's saying we're expecting God to create a new work here, but all we're getting is this chaotic darkness that we're lost in. Verse 11, he says, we all roar like bears, we mourn like sore doves. That word mourn, it's actually the same word used of meditating on the Torah in Joshua 1:8, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night. Also in Psalm 1:2, that the person who meditates on this will be like a tree planted by rivers of water. So we got some hyperlinks to those passages going on there. They'll mourn sore like doves. Okay, he says that the people are searching for rest like doves after he mentions this flood of judgment that is going to be coming in. Noah's story? Anyone sending out a dove to search for rest after a time of judgment? Oh, come on. Verse 12 is really fascinating, because there's three main Hebrew words that are used for sin throughout the Tanakh, and all three of them get used in that one verse. Through the next few verses, Isaiah continues to lament the lack of justice in his land. And in verse 16, he says that he saw there was no man, there was no intercessor. So again, we have decreation language, where God created humans in the land. When the first couple chapters of Genesis talks about God's creating humans in the land, it says that there was no man there to till the ground. So we're kind of going back to this pre-creation language. And get this, in verse 16, he also says, therefore his arm, God's arm, brought salvation to him. His righteousness has sustained them. For he put on righteousness as a breastplate, a helmet of salvation on his head, garments of vengeance for clothing, clad with zeal as his cloak. Now, if you've ever read Ephesians, you might recognize the origins of Paul's mention of the armor of God here in this passage. It also found its way into the apocryphal Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 5, verse 18, before Paul used it for his own ends as well. And there's so much else that we could talk about in this chapter, other creation and decreation hyperlinks, but I'll let you do that study for yourself. I just wanted to draw your attention to this here, because while all this stuff that we talked about doesn't necessarily make good preaching, it's not necessarily going to get amens in your church, I think it is super important that we focus not just on the doctrinal statements that make for easy preaching, but also on these hyperlinks within the biblical narratives. Because see, if all you do is focus on the doctrine that you want to get across, eventually you're going to run out of new doctrine to talk about. Eventually, after a short period of time in your church, the people there are going to hear all of the main stuff that you have to say. And then you're just going to start saying the same thing over and over again, just from a slightly different angle. But when you allow the Bible in all of its raw beauty to just amaze people with these little links back and forth between stories, they're going to continue to come back for more, because they're going to realize there is so much more from this book and these authors that they can learn that they had no clue was ever there. And that's the kind of thing that we try to focus on in our podcast. So if you found this little study interesting, be sure to go check out some of our episodes for more content like this.